thrust in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
With such simple words, Neil Armstrong and his crew of Apollo 11 became the first humans to land on a foreign celestial body. An idea thought preposterous only 10 years earlier, the Americans redefined the term "sky's the limit" on July 21st, 1969. In Cold War America, citizens everywhere rejoiced in their space race victory. In this video, we will explore the events leading up to this monumental moment, and further explain its impact on foreign relations and technical advances. Our foreign relations will describe Kennedy's policy with the Soviet Union, and the space race that developed after the launch of the satellite Sputnik. Our technological perspective will zone in on the development of NASA and the programs that Kennedy's administration set into place. Additionally, we will explain the effects the landing had on popular culture and how the world was united while watching history.
The Cold War began with the end of World War II, launching the two largest world powers, USA and the Soviet Union, into a colossal arms race. The lack of U.S. military assistance to the Soviets during the war led to hostile relations, as Truman took several months to dispatch soldiers to the war's Western Front. This resulted in massive Soviet casualties and great tension between General Secretary Stalin and the Allied powers. In 1945, the surrenders of both Japan and Germany ended World War II and left the United States and the USSR as two major post-war powers. The Potsdam Conference, created to discuss reparations, signified the last form of cooperation. Stalin represented the Communists, while Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, and Harry S. Truman, the U.S. President, represented the capitalist countries. The 1950s brought tension, diplomatic unity, and a ton of babies. Senator Joseph McCarthy was one of the leading anti-communist voices of the decade. He produced a piece of paper that he claimed contained a list of known communists working for the State Department, leading to widespread hostility and unity against any red entity. To prove that capitalism was a better alternative to communism, America actively competed academically, socially, and technologically with the Soviet Union. It appeared America had fallen behind the USSR when Sputnik 1 was launched on October 4, 1957. The Soviets had been working on a space program for nearly 30 years, and their success exposed America's technological inferiority. It was then the space race started, and President Eisenhower ordered the civilian rocket and satellite project Vanguard to launch a satellite akin to Sputnik as soon as possible. Just 1 month later, the Soviet Union sent out into space Sputnik 2, a heavier satellite carrying more cargo and the first living organism in space, a dog named Laika. This secondary victory led Americans to double their efforts. Immediately after Sputnik 2's launch, the U.S. Defense Department approved funding for another Earth-orbiting project. A launch in December of 1957 proved disastrous, and newspaper headlines across the country mocked its failure.
In July of 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act into law, establishing NASA. This is key, because NASA was only recently shut down, and it was the beacon of aeronautical engineers all over the world. The American program had been delayed in part because Eisenhower insisted that the space program should be a non-military operation, and that it should not reconfigure defense missiles for space exploration. Between 1958 and 1961, the U.S. and USSR strove constantly to create quicker, lighter, and more proficient satellites. Sputnik only weighed 184 pounds, and trajectory during launch could be shifted dramatically due to the change of a single pound. With this in mind, the United States successfully launched Explorer 1 in January of 1958. Explorer was the first satellite to detect the Van Allen radiation belt, the second layer of our magnetic field. Nearly a year later, the Soviets launched Luna 1. While it did not land on the moon, it was the first satellite to break out of Earth's orbit, and it made a successful orbit around the Sun. Hostility and the need for knowledge were at an all-time high. The U.S. had been developing a reconnaissance program led by satellites to spy on Soviets since 1959. This program was confidential and codenamed Corona. The Soviet Union had their own satellites, but they lagged behind the U.S. by 2 years in terms of proficiency. This private project rivaled the public drama of sending men to the moon, but its successes were generally unknown. In these years, spy satellites reported on the multitude of failures committed by both parties. As the presidency switched from Eisenhower to Kennedy, the space race intensified dramatically. The next objective was getting a man out of the atmosphere. The first man in space was Soviet Yuri Gagarin, who completed an orbit of the Earth in his Vostok spacecraft on April 12, 1961. The Kennedy administration responded promptly. Kennedy himself delivered numerous speeches identifying a new goal, getting a man on the moon.
Come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Said Kennedy, if the Soviets control space, they can control Earth. Kennedy knew that the first nation to put a man on the moon would prove itself superior, and he gave Americans the promise of a man on the moon before the decade ended. In the years leading up to 1969, the Soviet and American space powers battled ceaselessly, leading to a plethora of inventions, launches, failures, and hostility from both countries. Americans succeeded with sending a man into orbit on February 20th with John Glenn. Glenn's success helped inspire the great army of people working to reach the moon. Researchers, test pilots, machinists, factory workers, and industrialists from across the country worked toward this common goal. The Soviets had many successes of their own. On June 6, 1963, Valentina Tereshkova, a Soviet cosmonaut, became the first woman in orbit. Less than 4 years after Gagarin was launched into orbit, Vostok 2 shot into space in 1965, carrying the first multi-man crew. Both countries resumed racing after a brief respite between 1965 and 66. The U.S. moved to Gemini capsules, and the Soviet Union resumed with Vostok capsules. Although Lyndon B. Johnson did not run the country in the early 1960s, he headed the space program during Kennedy's presidency and continued it emphatically after the horrid assassination. In a period of great hostility, LBJ was able to sign a treaty with counterparts in London and Moscow which demilitarized outer space. During Johnson's administration, NASA conducted the Gemini manned space program, developed the Saturn V rocket and its launch facility, and prepared to make the first manned Apollo program flights. After the first successful orbit of the moon in 1968, NASA and the scientists in Houston were ready to send men to land on Earth's natural satellite.
On July 20th, 1969, U.S. citizens watched in awe as Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin Buzz Aldrin completed the first manned flight to the moon. The three-man crew aboard the Apollo 11 took a total of 4 days. The flight was well publicized, as people lined the streets near Saturn V, the launch pad.